The excavator's engine roared to life, tearing into the concrete as Sarah finally reclaimed her backyard from years of neglect. But when the woman in designer yoga pants came storming across the lawn, screaming about property values and neighborhood standards, Sarah had no idea she was about to uncover a secret that would destroy more than just an old swimming pool. Some neighbors aren't just nosy, they're dangerous. And some backyards hide more than broken dreams. Sarah Martinez stepped back as the excavator's hydraulic arm slammed into the edge of her abandoned swimming pool, sending chunks of debris flying across her overgrown backyard. After 3 years of staring at the algae-covered eyesore, she'd finally scraped together enough money to have it removed. The contractor, a weathered man named Eddie, worked the controls with practiced precision, each strike methodical and satisfying. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Eddie called over the diesel rumble. "Like breaking free from something that's been holding you back." Sarah nodded, wrapping her cardigan tighter against the October chill. The pool had been her ex-husband's pride and joy, his weekend project that never got finished, his promise of family barbecues and summer memories that never materialized. When David left 2 years ago, he'd taken everything of value and left her with the house, the mortgage, and a half-completed disaster that had become a breeding ground for mosquitoes and neighborhood complaints. You might want to step inside," Eddie shouted, revving the engine. "This next section's gonna get messy." Sarah retreated to her kitchen window, watching through the glass as the machine tore into 15 years of broken dreams. Each chunk of concrete that fell felt like another piece of her old life crumbling away. She'd started over at 38, new job, new independence, new determination to make this house truly hers. The excavator lurched suddenly, its bucket catching on something beneath the shallow end. Eddie frowned, maneuvering the arm to get a better angle. The obstruction held firm, and he climbed down to investigate. That's when Karen Morrison came marching across the yard. Sarah saw her first through the window, a blur of expensive athletic wear and righteous indignation storming across the lawn. Karen lived 3 houses down in the pristine colonial with the manicured hedges and the Range Rover that never had a speck of dirt on it. They'd never spoken beyond polite nods at the mailbox, but Sarah had heard about Karen from other neighbors. HOA president, despite their neighborhood not actually having an HOA. Self-appointed guardian of property values. Professional complainer, Sarah opened the back door just as Karen reached Eddie, who was crouched beside the excavator examining whatever had stopped his progress. "Excuse me." Karen's voice could have shattered the remaining concrete. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Eddie looked up, genuinely puzzled. "Removing a pool, as contracted. Without permits, without environmental studies, without consulting the neighborhood." Sarah stepped onto her back porch. "Karen, this is my property. I don't need to consult anyone." Karen spun around, her perfectly highlighted hair whipping dramatically. Up close, Sarah could see the fury blazing in her eyes, not just anger, but something deeper. Fear, maybe, or desperation. "You're destroying the neighborhood." Karen shrieked, gesturing wildly at the excavation. "Do you have any idea what this does to everyone's property values? The noise, the mess, the complete disregard for community standards." "It's my backyard," Sarah repeated, stepping down into the yard. "And it's 10 in the morning on a Wednesday. Perfectly legal hours for construction." Legal doesn't mean considerate. Some of us actually care about maintaining a certain level of what? Sarah felt her temper rising. Keeping up appearances? Pretending everything's perfect while the world falls apart around us? Eddie stood up, brushing dirt off his hands. "Ladies, maybe we could stay out of this." Karen snapped, then turned back to Sarah. "I'm calling the city. I'm calling the police. This is harassment. It's Wednesday morning yard work," Sarah interrupted. "And you're trespassing." Karen's face flushed red. "Trespassing? I'm protecting this neighborhood from people like you who think they can just do whatever they want without consequences. Some of us have standards. Some of us understand that our actions affect other people." The words hit like physical blows. Sarah had heard variations of this speech before, from David, from her mother, from everyone who thought she should be grateful for whatever scraps of happiness life threw her way. The message was always the same: don't rock the boat, don't ask for more, don't dare to change things. You know what affects other people. Sarah's voice rose to match Karen's volume, judging them for trying to improve their lives, acting like, "You're somehow better because you can afford to maintain a facade of perfection." Facade? Karen's laugh was sharp and bitter. "At least I don't let my property turn into a health hazard that breeds disease and attracts vermin. The only vermin I see is standing in my backyard right now." Eddie cleared his throat loudly. Ladies? We might have a bigger problem here." Both women turned to look at him. He was pointing at the obstruction that had stopped the excavator. What Sarah had assumed was a large rock or old foundation piece. But Eddie had scraped away enough dirt to reveal something else entirely: metal. Rusted and corroded, but definitely manufactured. And there was something else: fabric, maybe. Or plastic. It was hard to tell through the years of accumulated soil. And debris. "What is it?" Sarah asked, moving closer. Eddie's expression had gone grim. "I think we need to call the police." Karen went dead silent. The blood drained from her face so quickly that Sarah thought she might faint. Her eyes fixed on the partially excavated object with a look of pure terror. "No," Karen whispered. "No, you can't. You have to stop. You have to fill it back in." "Karen." "What?" Sarah began. "Stop." Karen lunged toward the excavator, but Eddie caught her arm. "I can't let you interfere with a potential crime scene." Crime scene. The words hung in the air like a curse. Sarah stared at the rusted metal emerging from what should have been solid earth beneath her pool. Her pool. Her backyard. Her property. "What is that?" she demanded, looking between Eddie and Karen. "What's buried in my yard?" Karen wrenched free from Eddie's grip and stumbled backward, shaking her head frantically. "It's nothing. It's just old construction debris. Everyone used to bury trash back there. It's probably just Karen." Sarah's voice cut through the rambling. "What do you know about this?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Then she turned and ran, across the yard toward her house, her designer sneakers slipping on the wet grass. Eddie was already pulling out his phone. "Yeah, I'm calling the cops. I've done enough construction to know the difference between trash and..." He trailed off, staring at the excavation site. "And what?" He met her eyes, and Sarah saw 15 years of experience in his weathered face. Experience that had taught him to recognize things no contractor should ever have to see. "I think that's a car down there. And cars don't usually get buried by accident." Sarah's legs went weak. She sank onto her porch steps, staring at the hole that had once been the shallow end of her swimming pool. The pool David had insisted they needed. The pool he'd been so eager to install, so determined to dig deep and get the foundation just right. The pool he'd abandoned so suddenly, right around the time their next-door neighbors, the Weatherbys, had moved away without warning in the middle of the night. Eddie's voice seemed to come from very far away as he spoke to the 911 dispatcher. Sarah heard fragments: construction site, possible vehicle, need investigators. But all she could think about was Karen Morrison's face when she saw what was buried beneath the concrete. Not surprise. Not confusion, recognition, and terror. So pure it could only mean one thing. Karen knew exactly whose car was buried in Sarah's backyard. She knew who had put it there, and she knew why. First came Officer Martinez, no relation, despite the shared surname, a young patrolman who took one look at the partially exposed metal and immediately called for backup. Then Detective Ray Castellanos, a heavy-set man in his 50s who moved with the deliberate pace of someone who'd seen enough crime scenes to know that rushing led to mistakes. Behind him came the crime scene techs, the photographer, and finally the coroner's van that sat ominously at the curb like a period at the end of a sentence nobody wanted to finish. Sarah watched from her kitchen window as her backyard transformed into something from a television show. Yellow tape stretched between stakes driven into her lawn. Strangers in latex gloves tramped through her flower beds. The excavator sat silent and abandoned, its bucket still hovering over the hole that had changed everything. "Mrs. Martinez." Detective Castellanos knocked on her back door. "I need to ask you some questions." She led him into a kitchen, noticing how his eyes swept the room, cataloging details, looking for inconsistencies. The coffee maker with its single-serving pod. The table set for one. the stack of real estate continuing education materials she'd been studying to advance her career. "How long have you lived here?" he asked, settling into one of her mismatched chairs. 15 years. My husband and I bought it when we got married. She corrected herself automatically. Ex-husband. And when did you decide to remove the pool? 3 years ago. Right after the divorce was finalized. Sarah poured herself coffee with shaking hands. I finally saved enough money to do it this year. Why remove it? Pools usually add value to a property. Through the window, she could see Tex carefully excavating around the buried object. More metal was visible now, definitely a car, as Eddie had suspected. Dark blue or black, though it was hard to tell through the rust and corrosion. It was never finished, she said. David started the project but lost interest. It became a maintenance nightmare: algae, mosquitoes, city code violations. I got tired of looking at his abandoned dreams. Castellanos made notes in a worn leather notebook. Tell me about your ex-husband. David Martinez. We divorced 2 years ago, but he'd been gone for 3. Just walked out one day, said he needed space to find himself. Sarah's laugh held no humor. Apparently, he found himself with a 24-year-old dental hygienist in Phoenix. And he did the original pool excavation himself. Mostly. He hired a company to dig the initial hole, then decided he could handle the rest. You know how some men get with projects, convinced they can save money by doing it themselves. When exactly was this? Sarah thought back, trying to pin down dates that had blurred together in the haze of a failing marriage. Summer of 2010. I think. He'd been talking about it for months, then suddenly became obsessed with getting it done. Worked on it every weekend, sometimes taking days off from his job. What kind of work did David do? Insurance claims adjuster. He traveled a lot, which is probably why. She gestured vaguely, not wanting to voice the obvious conclusion about her ex-husband's infidelity. A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, Sarah could see Karen Morrison standing at the police tape, arguing with Officer Martinez. Even from a distance, her body language screamed desperation, wild gestures, animated facial expressions, the posture of someone fighting for their life. Excuse me a moment, Castellanos said, rising from his chair. Sarah watched him walk outside and approach Karen. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see Karen's face growing more animated, more desperate. At one point, she grabbed the detective's arm, and he gently but firmly removed her hand. Then Karen pointed directly at Sarah's kitchen window. Sarah stepped back instinctively, though she knew they'd already seen her. Whatever Karen was saying, it involved her. The detective nodded, asked a few more questions, then Karen stormed off toward her house, her designer yoga pants somehow still pristine despite her obvious distress. Castellanos returned to the kitchen, his expression more guarded than before. Mrs. Morrison seems very concerned about this excavation, he said carefully. Karen's concerned about everything. She appointed herself the neighborhood watch committee. Sarah tried to keep her voice neutral, but she could hear the edge creeping in. What did she tell you? She mentioned that you and your ex-husband had some loud arguments around the time he was working on the pool. Public disputes about money, about his work schedule. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. Every married couple argues. Especially when one spouse is spending thousands of dollars on a project they never finish. She also said David was acting strangely that summer. Paranoid, secretive. Working on the pool at odd hours, early morning, late at night. David was always secretive. It's probably why he was so good at hiding his affair. But even as she said it, Sarah felt doubt creeping in. Had David been acting stranger than usual that summer? She remembered fragments, him coming home with muddy clothes at midnight, claiming he'd been working on the pool by flashlight. The way he'd snapped at her when she suggested hiring professionals to finish the job. His sudden insistence that the foundation needed to be deeper, much deeper than any pool required. Mrs. Martinez, I need to ask this directly, do you have any reason to believe your ex-husband might have buried something in your backyard? The question hung between them like an accusation. Outside, the techs had uncovered more of the vehicle. Sarah could see a license plate holder now, though the plate itself was missing. "I don't know," she said quietly. "I honestly don't know what David was capable of." Her phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number: "You need to stop this. Some secrets should stay buried." A friend. Sarah stared at the message, ice forming in her stomach. She showed it to Castellanos, who immediately called for a tech to examine her phone. "Has anyone else contacted you about the excavation?" he asked. "Just Karen, when she came storming over here screaming about property values." "What exactly did she say?" Sarah tried to remember Karen's exact words, but they'd been delivered with such frantic intensity that they'd blurred together. She was upset about permits and environmental studies. She said I was ruining the neighborhood, destroying property values. But when Eddie found the car, when he said we needed to call police, Karen went crazy. She begged us to stop, to fill it back in. She knew something was down there, detective. I'm sure of it." Castellanos made more notes. "We'll be interviewing Mrs. Morrison formally. In the meantime, I need you to think carefully about that summer in 2010. Any unusual visitors to your house? Any strange conversations your husband might have had? Anyone who might have had reason to, detective?" Officer Martinez called from the backyard. "You need to see this." They hurried outside, where the crime scene techs had uncovered most of the vehicle's roof and part of the driver's side window. The glass was intact but spider-webbed with cracks. Through the damaged windshield, Sarah could see the vague outline of something inside, something that might once have been a person. "Jesus," Castellanos muttered, then caught himself. "Sorry, The coroner, a thin woman with prematurely grey hair, looked up from her examination. "We are going to need to lift the vehicle to properly access the remains. But from what I can see..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "This person has been here for a very long time." Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Not literally, the earth was solid enough, but everything she'd believed about her life, her marriage, her quiet suburban existence was crumbling like the concrete around the buried car. "How long?" she whispered. "Based on the decomposition and the condition of the vehicle, I'd estimate 12 to 15 years. 15 years. Right around the time David had become obsessed with digging the perfect pool foundation. Right around the time their neighbors, the Weatherbys, had disappeared. In the middle of the night. Sarah's phone buzzed again. Another message from the same unknown number: "Last warning. Stop the excavation or everyone will know what you helped cover up." This time, Castellanos saw the message as it arrived. His face went grim, and he immediately signaled for Officer Martinez to join them. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm going to need you to come to the station for a more formal interview. And I'm going to need you to contact a lawyer." "A lawyer? But I haven't done anything wrong." "I didn't even know." "Someone thinks you did. Someone who's been watching this excavation very closely." He looked toward Karen Morrison's house, where Sarah could see a figure standing at an upstairs window. "Someone who's desperate enough to threaten you to keep this buried." As they loaded the last of the crime scene equipment, Eddie approached Sarah with a grim expression. I'm sorry about all this. In 30 years of construction, I've never..." He shook his head. "But there's something else you should know. When I was examining the foundation around where the car was buried, I found concrete work that doesn't match the rest of the pool construction. Professional work. The kind you'd only get from someone who really knew what they were doing." "What does that mean?" "It means whoever buried that car had help. Someone with experience in concrete and excavation." Eddie's weathered face was troubled. "Someone who knew exactly how to hide a vehicle so it would never be found." As Sarah watched the coroner's van pull away from her house, she realized that her quiet suburban nightmare. Part 3. The end. As the police station smelled like burnt coffee and industrial disinfectant, a combination that made Sarah's stomach churn as she sat in the beige interview room with her hastily hired attorney, Margaret Chen. Margaret was young, probably younger than Sarah, but she had the kind of sharp, no-nonsense demeanor that commanded respect even in her discount suit. "Remember, you don't have to answer anything that makes you uncomfortable," Margaret whispered as Detective Castellanos entered with a thick file folder. "We appreciate you coming in, Mrs. Martinez," Castellanos said, settling across from them. "I know this is difficult, but we need to establish a timeline for the summer of 2010. Sarah nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Through the small window, she could see storm clouds gathering, appropriate, given that her entire world was about to be turned upside down. "Let's start with your neighbors from that time period. Who lived on your street?" "The same people, mostly. It's a stable neighborhood. Families stay for decades." Sarah paused, thinking. Except for the Weatherbys. They lived next door, but they moved that summer. "Tell me about them." "Frank and Linda Weatherby. They were in their 60s, maybe early 70s. Retired. Frank used to be some kind of engineer, and Linda was a teacher. They kept to themselves mostly, but they were polite. Always waved when they saw you. And they moved suddenly." Sarah felt that familiar twist in her stomach. Very suddenly. One day they were there, the next day there was a moving truck. I remember being surprised because Linda had been planning her fall garden just weeks before. She'd asked to borrow my seed catalog. "Did you speak to them before they left?" "I tried to. I went over to say goodbye, maybe get their forwarding address, but they were already gone. The house was empty except for the movers." Sarah's voice grew quieter. "I always wondered if something had happened. Health issues, family emergency. It seemed so unlike them." Castellanos made notes in his leather book. What kind of car did Frank Weatherby drive? The question hit Sarah like cold water. A dark blue sedan. Toyota Camry, I think. Maybe 10 years old. She looked up sharply. "Oh God. The car in my yard, is it Frank's?" "We are running the VIN number now." "What about Linda?" "She didn't drive. Anymore. Had cataracts, I think." Margaret placed a warning hand on Sarah's arm, but Castellanos continued gently. "During that summer, did you notice any interaction between your husband and the Weatherbys?" Sarah tried to remember. That summer had been a blur of arguments, David's obsessive pull project, and her growing certainty that their marriage was falling apart. But now, forced to focus, fragments began to surface. David used to talk to Frank sometimes. Over the fence, you know? Frank knew about construction, the engineering background. He'd give David advice about the excavation. What kind of advice? Soil, composition, drainage issues. Frank said David was digging too deep for a standard pool, that he'd need additional reinforcement. Sarah felt sick. David said Frank didn't understand his vision. Did Frank seem concerned about the project? Maybe. Toward the end, before they moved, I remember hearing raised voices from their backyard. David and Frank arguing about something. But I was inside, I couldn't make out the words. Castellanos leaned forward. "Mrs. Martinez, I need you to think very carefully. In the days before the Weatherbys disappeared, did you notice anything unusual? Any strange visitors, odd behavior, anything at all?" Sarah closed her eyes, forcing herself back to that summer. The heat had been oppressive, the kind that made everyone irritable. David had been working on the pool at all hours, coming to bed covered in dirt and concrete dust. She'd been working double shifts at the hospital. They'd needed the money. For David's project. "There was one night," she said slowly. "I came home from a late shift, maybe 2 in the morning. David's truck was in the driveway, but there was another vehicle too. A white panel van. I remember being annoyed because it was blocking the mailbox." "Did you see who it belonged to?" "No, I was exhausted. I just wanted to get inside and sleep. But when I woke up the next morning, it was gone." "And David?" "He was already up, working on the pool. Said he'd been up since dawn." Sarah paused. "But he was wearing clean clothes. Usually when he worked. On the pool, he was filthy by breakfast." Margaret shot her a warning look, but Sarah continued. "The next day, I noticed the Weatherbys' house was dark. No lights, no movement. I thought maybe they'd gone on vacation, but Linda had never mentioned any travel plans." "When did you realize they'd moved?" 3 days later. I saw the moving truck and went over to investigate. The movers said they'd been hired to clear out the house, that the owners had already relocated. It all happened so fast. Castellanos closed his notebook. Mrs. Martinez, we've been in contact with your ex-husband in Phoenix. He's agreed to come back for questioning. Sarah's blood ran cold. David's coming here. He should arrive tomorrow. We've also spoken with the moving company that handled the Weatherby relocation. According to their records, the job was paid for in cash by a third party. The customer who hired them wasn't named Weatherby. Then who? We are still investigating. But Mrs. Martinez, there's something else you need to know. We've identified the remains in the vehicle. The dental records confirm it's Frank Weatherby. The room seemed to spin. Sarah gripped the edge of the table, fighting waves of nausea. Frank is dead. He's been dead all this time. We are working on locating Linda Weatherby now. She may be a witness, or... Castellanos left the sentence unfinished. Margaret leaned forward. Detective, unless you're charging my client with something, I think we are done here. Not quite. Castellanos opened his file folder and pulled out a series of photographs. These were taken at your house today, after you left for the station. The photos showed Sarah's backyard from various angles, but they all focused on one thing: footprints in the soft earth around the excavation site. Fresh footprints that hadn't been there when the crime scene team finished their work. Someone visited your backyard while you were gone. Someone who wanted a closer look at what we found. Sarah stared at the photos. The footprints were small, narrow, definitely a woman's shoe. And they led not just to the excavation site, but to her back door, where someone had clearly attempted to peer through the kitchen window. The prints match athletic shoes, size 7. Designer brand, based on the tread pattern. Castellanos looked at her steadily. Do you know anyone who might fit that description? Sarah thought of Karen Morrison in her pristine yoga attire, her expensive sneakers that never seemed to touch actual dirt. Size 7 sounded about right for Karen's petite frame. You think Karen was in my yard? We think someone was very interested in what we found today. Interested enough to risk contaminating a crime scene. Castellanos gathered the photos. Mrs. Martinez, I strongly suggest you stay somewhere else tonight. With family, friends, a hotel, anywhere but your house. Why? Because someone has been sending you threatening messages. Someone who knows details about a 15-year-old murder. And that someone is getting desperate. As they left the police station, Margaret walked Sarah to her car in the gathering darkness. Sarah, you need to take this seriously. If your ex-husband was involved in Frank Weatherby's death, and if someone else helped cover it up, you could be in real danger. But I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't even know. It doesn't matter what you knew. It matters what the killer thinks you know. Margaret's voice was grim. Someone buried a man in your backyard and has been living with that secret for 15 years. They're not going to let you destroy their life without a fight. Sarah drove through her neighborhood in a daze, noting details she'd never paid attention to before. The way Mrs. Chen's porch light flickered. Had it always done that, or was it a signal? The unfamiliar car parked on Maple Street. Was someone watching her house? The figure she glimpsed in Karen Morrison's upstairs window. Was that Karen, or someone else? Everything that had once seemed normal and safe now felt threatening. Her quiet suburban street had become a maze of secrets and lies, and she was trapped. At the center of it all, her phone buzzed as she pulled into her driveway. Another message from the unknown number: you should have listened. Now it's too late. Some people never learn when to stop digging. Sarah stared at the message, her hand shaking. Through her kitchen window, she could see that someone had left. Something on her counter. Something that definitely hadn't been there when she'd left for the police station. A manila envelope with her name written in block letters. Someone had been inside her house. Part 4. THECONFESSION. Sarah called Detective Castellanos from her car, her hands trembling as she held the phone. Through her kitchen window, the manila envelope sat on her counter like a loaded gun. Don't go inside, he ordered. We are on our way. She waited in her driveway as police cars surrounded her house for the second time that day. Crime scene texts swarmed through her home while she stood on the sidewalk, feeling like a stranger in her own life. Neighbors emerged from their houses, Mrs. Patterson from across the street, the Johnsons from 2 doors down, and inevitably, Karen Morrison. Karen approached with her usual theatrical concern, but Sarah noticed her expensive athletic shoes were now muddy around the edges. Sarah, honey, what's happening? First the excavation, now more police. Karen's voice carried just the right note of neighborly worry, but her eyes were calculating, scanning the police activity with keen interest. Someone broke into my house, Sarah said flatly, watching Karen's reaction. Oh my God. Did they take anything? Was it those drug addicts from downtown? I keep telling the city council we need better security patrols. But Karen's surprise seemed rehearsed, like an actress who'd practiced her lines. And she kept glancing toward Sarah's backyard, where the excavation site was now covered with tarps and police tape. Detective Castellanos emerged from the house carrying the manila envelope in an evidence bag. Mrs. Martinez, we need to talk. Inside the envelope were photocopies of newspaper clippings from August 2010. Missing person reports for Frank and Linda Weatherby. Articles about their sudden relocation and concerned neighbors who'd reported suspicious circumstances. And at the bottom, a handwritten note, you were always asking too many questions. Some people don't know when to mind their own business. Stop the investigation or join your neighbors in the backyard. The handwriting analysis will take time, Castellanos said, but there's something else. We found signs of forced entry at your back door, fresh scratches around the lock, footprints matching the ones from this afternoon. Size 7 athletic shoes. Sarah looked toward Karen's house, where lights blazed in every window. Are you going to arrest her? We need more evidence. But Mrs. Martinez, there's something else you need to know. We located Linda Weatherby. Sarah's heart stopped. Is she? She's alive. Living in a senior care facility in Oregon under her maiden name. We spoke to her an hour ago. Castellanos' expression was grim. She told us a very interesting story about the night she and her husband disappeared. The detective opened his notebook. According to Linda, on the night of August 15, 2010, she and Frank were awakened by sounds from your backyard. Digging, machinery, voices. Frank went outside to investigate. And he never came back. Linda waited until morning, then went looking for him. She found blood on the ground near your fence and Frank's reading glasses crushed in the dirt. Sarah felt the world tilt. Blood. She was terrified, convinced that whoever had hurt Frank would come for her next. So she packed a bag and called her nephew in Oregon. He drove down that same night, helped her clear out the most important belongings, and drove her to safety. But the moving truck, her nephew hired the movers to make it look like a normal relocation. Linda was afraid that if anyone knew she'd witnessed something, she'd end up like Frank. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. David killed Frank. Linda heard two voices that night. A man and a woman. The woman was arguing with the man, telling him this was insane, that they couldn't go through with it. A woman. Sarah felt ice in her veins. Did Linda recognize the voices? The man sounded like your husband. But the woman? Castellanos paused. Linda said she sounded like someone from the neighborhood. Someone she'd heard before but couldn't quite place. Karen. It had to be Karen. But why would Karen help David murder Frank Weatherby? What possible connection could there be between her perfectionist neighbor and her cheating ex-husband? Sarah's phone rang. David's number appeared on the screen, and her blood went cold. Answer it, Castellanos instructed, signaling to a tech to start recording. Act normal. Sarah's hands shook as she accepted the call. David. Sarah, Jesus Christ. What have you done? His voice was strained, panicked. The police called me. They said you found something in the backyard. I removed the pool, David. Like I should have done years ago. You had no right. That pool was my project, my design. You had no right to destroy it. Castellanos nodded encouragingly, and Sarah pressed on. Your design. Is that what you call burying Frank Weatherby under our swimming pool? Silence. Long, damning silence. I don't know what you're talking about, David finally said, but his voice had lost its bluster. The police have Linda, David. She heard everything that night. She knows what you did. Linda's dead. The words exploded out of him before he could stop them. She's been dead for 15 years. Castellanos' eyes widened. This was more than they'd hoped for, a clear admission that David knew about Linda's supposed death. How do you know Linda's dead, David? How could you possibly know? That unless, because I was there. David's voice cracked. Because I watched Frank have a heart attack when he saw what was in that hole. Because I helped bury him to save my own ass. The confession hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt sick, betrayed not just by David's infidelity but by the realization that she'd been married to a killer. What was in the hole, David? What was already there when Frank saw it? But David had caught himself. I need a lawyer. I'm not saying anything else. The line went dead. Castellanos immediately got on his radio, coordinating with Phoenix police to arrest David before he could disappear. Mrs. Martinez, he said when he finished, your ex-husband just confessed to being present at Frank Weatherby's death and helping dispose of the body. But he also revealed something else. There was already something buried in that hole when Frank discovered it. Something else. Someone else. Your ex-husband and an accomplice had already buried one body when Frank Weatherby stumbled onto their crime scene. Frank's death was secondary, collateral damage to cover up an earlier murder. Sarah's mind reeled. 2 bodies. 2 murders. And David had said, I watched Frank have a heart attack, not, I killed Frank. Frank had died from shock at what he'd seen. Who was the first victim? We are working on that. But Mrs. Martinez, David mentioned an accomplice. Someone who helped him with the original burial. Someone who's been living in this neighborhood for 15 years, watching and waiting. Through the window, Sarah could see Karen Morrison pacing back and forth in her living room, a phone pressed to her ear. Her gestures were frantic, desperate. It's Karen, isn't it? She's been David's partner this whole time. We think so. But we need proof. And we need to figure out who the first victim was. Castellanos closed his notebook. Mrs. Martinez, I want you to pack a bag. You're not safe here tonight. But as Sarah headed toward her bedroom, her phone buzzed with a text from Karen, we need to talk. Come to my house now. Come alone, or the police will never find where we buried Linda. Sarah showed the message to Castellanos. She still thinks Linda is dead. She doesn't know you found her. That's our advantage. But Mrs. Martinez, under no circumstances are you going over there. What if she runs? What if she disappears like she helped Linda disappear? We have units watching her house. But even as he said it, they heard the sound of a car engine starting. Through the window, they could see Karen's Range Rover backing out of her driveway. All units, suspect is mobile, Castellanos barked into his radio, but it was too late. Karen Morrison had vanished into the night, taking with her the secrets of who had been the first to die in Sarah's backyard, and why a suburban insurance adjuster and a neighborhood perfectionist had become partners in murder.as police cars. Raced through the streets searching for Karen, Sarah realized the most terrifying truth of all. For 15 years, she had been living next to a killer. Someone who had smiled and waved at the mailbox, who had attended neighborhood barbecues and complained about property values, all while knowing that 2 people lay buried beneath Sarah's swimming pool. Someone who was now desperate enough to kill again to protect those secrets, and somewhere in the darkness, Karen Morrison was making her final move.